Hi, everybody, and welcome to the crossover episode, the next crossover episode of Everything Compliance with the great women in compliance. And you better believe that I am with some freaking great women right this minute. I am here with Karen Moore, Lisa Fine, and Hemma Lomax, and we will be talking about everything compliance today. So to kick it off, let's start with Lisa. What do you want to talk about?
I am really excited to talk about the topic of the failure to prevent fraud, guidance, and regulation in the UK. Now, understandably, that may be more exciting to me than it is to a lot of people, but I think it's a really important law that's coming into effect in September. And I work at a dual listed company in the US and the UK. And I also think it's very important to think about because given all of the other questions that are going on globally, I think this is a law that's really stepping in to impact what we're doing and to think about. And let me give you a couple points just kind of in the legislation. One of the biggest changes is that instead of thinking, and at least I traditionally think about fraud as, are we victims of fraud? What has happened to our company? Failure to prevent sort of turns this around and says, you are now responsible to make sure that your company doesn't actually engage in fraud. And it also doesn't require senior level knowledge of these sorts of frauds either. Although I think that I'm sure if it's a rogue employee who's a low mid-level person, that's not going to be their first thing. But basically it is the intention of benefiting the organization or the customer or your clients or anybody, not just you personally. So what I think is interesting about that is I don't think they've fully defined yet what exactly that means and what is the benefit, but I do think that's interesting. There's a lot of detailed guidance that's come out with what they think are reasonable fraud prevention procedures, and the law comes into effect on September 1st. What's interesting too is that while the guideline or the compliance guidelines that have come in the UK really look more at a definition of senior managers, it gets wider on that. You can look at anybody worldwide who's carrying out businesses. Now, it is also the fraud has to be under law or part of the UK. You have to have a UK nexus. If it's a UK-based employee, wherever they're based, that will matter. If it happens in the UK, if your company is listed there, if you have business in the UK, it's really important. So I think in a lot of ways, it's really pushing us to look more at fraud and how we're proactively looking to handle it. One of the other big parts that I think they're looking for primarily is while no one size fits all for organizations, they do expect that you have a clear owner or designated person to be kind of your failure to prevent person. And the last point I'll make about it is that only large organizations, you have to be over more than 250 employees, over 36 million pounds, and more than 18 million in total assets. I really just think it's important because this is kind of going in through, it's a little dry, but it is kind of coming into the gap of where enforcement will be and where we're going to be looking at things going forward and what can be a leading law for us to consider. And the final point I'll say about that is that there is also, as many of the Serious Fraud Office is now more likely to have financial consequences or tax from that part. And from all accounts, including another great woman of compliance who spends a lot of time in this, Mary Inman, and others who I've heard from in the UK, fairly soon they're going to be adopting a similar whistleblower laws as we have in the US and many other places where people will be compensated for them, even though culturally that was frowned on. Now, I know, Kristy, you lived there for a while, so you probably have a take on some of these things, but as somebody who is working with a UK-based company, it's become a really big deal lately. So with that, I'll turn it over to the rest of the group.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, is there an extraterritorial element? hate to put you on the spot with that, but I'm just wondering if the fraud took place in America and has a UK nexus, is that going to be something that we need to consider in America if we have a multinational company?
I think so, but I'm not positive. I think then it would be sort of almost a judge. I mean, I'm going to go with a little bit of the it depends as a non-expert on this. But if you carry on business or part of business in the UK and that person does it, or something else that's related to it. For example, I think if it's a multinational and you have one part of it that's only based in the US, I think the nexus will be much more distant. But I do think it's something to keep in mind. I think the bigger focus is a much clearer UK-based nexus, and that's the expertise. What I don't know if I know the answer to is if you're a UK-based company and something happens to you in, I don't know, Mexico, how would that impact it? I think so.
We'll find out. I'm sure the SFO will let us know.
Will definitely let us know, but I do think given the fact that the US was the largest prosecutor of everything for a long time, and most of us have some sort of nexus to the UK, I think in the US it's worth keeping an eye on.
Also, bad idea for your company to commit fraud. Just in general, bad idea.
Generally, not really what we're not trying to figure out where to move it to.
If you are, don't move it to the UK.
And let's just not do it.
Karen, what did you have to say about this?
Yeah, I'm just really curious to see how this plays out because ultimately so much of compliance anyway has been informed by federal sentencing guidelines, which is kind of the failure to prevent criminal activity full stop. We're all always looking at that. There's a much higher degree of specificity here. And I'm really curious to see what happens with the Serious Fraud Office newly published self-reporting incentives, right? Whether companies, in an effort to control the narrative, right? It was despite our best efforts that this bad thing happened, so let us please tell you about it, whether we're not going to see a flood of failure to prevent fraud kind of self-reporting going on at the SFO. And I don't know if you've got insight into that. I think it's probably wait and see, but
I think it's, again, a little bit more of a wait and see type thing. I think it is also, we don't know yet. I think right away, I think all companies are still figuring out exactly how to comply because the guidelines are fairly detailed. But I think it's also whether or not what the amount and the significance of it.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Hema, what do you want to come with?
Yeah, I was thinking about the False Claims Act and how we're seeing a sharp shift in the way it's being used in the US, not just for fraudulent billing anymore, but I wanted to really talk about what's going on there. So we've got things like diversity, civil rights obligations, ethical sourcing, cybersecurity certifications. This is a massive change when it comes to enforcement with the FCA, and I think a bit of a wake-up call. So in terms of failure to prevent, we just piggybacking on what you've just been talking about, we now have to be very thoughtful about what we're saying we are doing and achieving when it comes to our compliance programs. Because if you are certifying to the government that you're compliant with certain laws, you need to make sure that's materially true, even in grey areas. Now, that seems like a no-brainer. Why would we be making materially false statements to the US government? This is one of those places where your aspirations don't necessarily always meet your operational reality. And that's what the FCA is coming for now. There are certain hot topic areas for the government right now. And if you are, for example, saying that you comply with the ADA, if you comply with the American Disabilities Act, or if you are complying with discrimination laws, they may come and find out if you're doing that by evaluating your compliance program. So I'll give you one example of that. Say, for example, that there have been key town whistleblower complaints about anti-Semitism at a university, for example. That university will now probably need to scour through its hotline and its case management to find out if there have been complaints internally, and then be on proof as to whether or not they have actually investigated those cases appropriately. What do those things mean? Investigate it appropriately? That remains to be seen. We've all got a good sense of what appropriate investigations mean, good case management, good hotline management. But now I like to say this is going to be the acid test of the way you've been running your hotline management and your case investigations, for example. So definitely something on my mind. I'd love to hear from the other ladies on here. What we need to do now as compliance professionals is use this opportunity to make sure that when we are making statements to the government about certification with broad laws, that we have a narrative on what that means and what are our best faith efforts to operationalize those intentions. Now, look, it doesn't mean that there won't be problems, but I think the real focus will be on how you have set up your compliance processes. I mentioned the hotline is one, but there'll be many others. So cybersecurity is another example. You make good claims about cybersecurity compliance, cybersecurity protections, but you might have a breach. Fine. People expect their breaches, but what we really need to look at is what caused the breach and what should you have been doing to prevent that breach. Again, not news to compliance professionals, but I think the heightened FCA enforcement is going to put a spotlight on these things, and certainly something I'll be thinking about going forward.
All right, Karen. Yeah, I hear you have some thoughts on this. What are these thoughts on this you have?
I do. I've been really concerned about False Claims Act recently, and Hema's spot on in terms of we've got to all be so much more aware of it than maybe we were before. There was a development last year, pre-current administration, that gives different enforcement agencies the right to bring False Claims Act without going through the DOJ. So Could be a whole variety of agenda that we're not aware of. So that's one thing I think that we need to keep an eye on. The second thing that concerns me enormously, and there's been a lot of airtime on this one, is the fact that if you're a government contractor, you have to represent that you have no DEI program involved in your provision of the government contracting. And Hema, you mentioned that in terms of the certification, that's going to be a breach of contract, which then leads to False Claims Act, treble damages. It's a pretty big one. But the one that I feel like has snuck in a little bit undercover that's really worrying me in the new geopolitical environment is the intended expanded use of the False Claims Act to go after customs and tariff payments and misrepresentations. Because I think a lot of companies are thinking, I don't have a whole lot of government contracting. A lot of the False Claims Act isn't really going to touch on me. But in today's environment where we've got so much abrupt shifting of international sourcing based on either politics, actual geographical events, which have meant that we've needed to switch quite quickly, the chances that you violate customs laws by using the wrong part of the harmonized tariff schedule or falsely claiming your source of production or bringing your goods in under the wrong free trade agreement. And there are ample opportunities that are not intentional misrepresentation that nevertheless can now bring you under False Claims Act cover, especially with this increased focus on customs and tariffs. And so I'm really concerned that companies, trade departments are not overlooking this, not understating this, not under evaluating this. I think it's only going to get more complicated. And then the very last kind of nuance is to remember that False Claims Act can also be brought not by the government, but by individuals. These relators get a pretty hefty share of the bounty. So there's a big financial incentive. They do not need to be internal whistleblowers. They can be people that are just aware, and there's a big business going on out there with a pretty hefty double-digit increase, I think, in the number of relator brought False Claims Act claims. So just think this is an act that's maybe not been so much the focus of compliance programs in the past, but we really need to, just as kind of Hema highlighted, really be conscious and understand where we might touch on False Claims Act liability.
Yeah, I agree. I'm waiting for every time I went up to Los Angeles yesterday. I live in Orange County South, and I saw so many of those ads for if you've been in an accident, call me here. I am waiting for the if you understand a false claim, call me here plaintiff's law, because if it gets the way that it could, and those are big settlements, I think that we could actually see the tort lawyers putting up billboards trying to get people within companies to just say what's going on. Lisa, what do you think here?
I think that is a concern. I think the bigger concern in my mind is the lack of clarity and the sort of some levels of chaos, particularly when it comes to the certifications. And I was going to talk about either the DEI or other things, because you also have state requirements for certain things and certain certifications. Organizations may be put in the US in a situation where they're putting in contrasting. What are you supposed to do if you've got one directive from the state that's doing a contract and a government contract, for example, or anything else, or somebody brings that up, or it becomes politically motivated. Similarly, internationally, from the ESG or other requirements like that, which is another area that these things are coming in, wherever you sit on this, you've just got more and more risk and people going after those claims. And I guess the last point that I have is, some of this FCPA is all being pushed more and more towards the American interests and safety and drugs and all of these other things, which I think it's good to be prioritizing some of them. But with that said, here we are now, where is the clarity between what we're doing on a safety security standpoint versus what we're doing as a tort or another claim? And how do we make sure that the ethical right actors aren't the ones getting in trouble from just trying to figure out what to do? So those are my thoughts on it.
Hema, did you have anything else you wanted to say after all that commentary?
No, I think that Karen and Lisa and yourself, you covered the points magnificently. The only thing I'll add, maybe it's underscoring what Karen said, is that the Blanche memo is effectively deputized employees and students, wherever it may be in the organization, as the people to speak up and as a weapon really against institutions that falsely certify compliance. So you've made the point already about the great rewards there may be up to 30% for those people that are relators or qui tam whistleblowers. But just not to scare compliance professionals, but again, it's what we want, isn't it? We want people to speak up. So again, lean in on your speak up culture. Make sure they're speaking to you first and pay attention. Because even if you don't agree with what they're saying, they may be raising something very important to you that an FCA claim will be coming right after them. So I'd say this is just another call to action to listen up very carefully to people, because you have a chance to remedy these things and be in compliance.
Yeah, absolutely. Lisa.
One other comment to what Hema was just saying. I think it's also very important not just to listen, but to remember the retaliation or anti-retaliation, because even with people that may listen and find something not substantiated or something else, if the person doesn't feel that they were well heard or retaliated against, or something happens with layoffs, you have to be prepared for those consequences, because I think there are a lot of situations where retaliation does exist, and we're not always great as compliance professionals in recognizing it and following up. But I think it's even larger now when somebody, goes out and feels unheard, may then go out and make a false claims act, which, whether substantiated or not, is going to be a lot harder. So the speaking up and the retaliation side, I think, are critical.
100%.
Yeah. And let's not forget that those investigations, even if unwarranted, are very expensive for the company. So we definitely want to try to avoid those if we possibly can. Your internal investigation is probably much less expensive. All right, Karen, what would you like to talk about?
I would like to talk about rewards and incentives, one of the kinds of compliance programs everywhere. They've been around for a long time in terms of hallmarks of effective compliance programs in the ECCP and elsewhere. And I've seen companies struggle with this. I was thinking about it a lot, and I'm sure that you all, and so do all of our listeners, do in your day-to-day life, start thinking about compliance-related activities. I went to the gym this morning. I hate going to the gym. I do not voluntarily go to the gym. And so I've created an environment for myself in which I am incentivized to go to the gym, beyond the fact that it's just good for you. I can think of a million reasons every morning that I wake up that I do not want to go to the gym, why it's not a good idea to go to the gym, and why I will definitely go to the gym tomorrow. So what I have done is set up trainer sessions at my gym. And it's my biggest expense right now. I don't get facials or fancy haircuts, but I do have a fantastic trainer. I love him. But I wake up and I have an obligation to go to the gym, right? On Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 8:30, I must leave my house because somebody is waiting for me at the gym. So I'm already incentivized. I also like him, so I don't want to disappoint him. I also know that it's really expensive, and I know myself, the idea of paying anyway, if I don't go, just really drives me crazy, paying and not getting any value out of it. So that incentivizes me. My child, who's been home for the last couple of weeks, has been coming with me. And so I'm trying to set also a good example of responsibility and doing things, and also keeping her health up. So I've incentivized myself to go to the gym. There's a bit of virtue signaling that can go on as well. I have this halo the rest of the day. I'm so good because I went to the gym. It's kind of crazy. I got to see Kristy at the gym in Austin too. So I was like, oh yes, somebody observed me going to the gym. That's even better. So all sorts of good benefits. Then I started thinking about my child who is moving to take a new job in another state in August. How do I make sure that they are incentivized to keep going to the gym? Because even though they are an adult and they should be doing it through their own initiative, I want this really good intention to continue. So I will pay for gym membership because my daughter insists on developing a career in nonprofit theater technical sound, and will be making minimum wage or close to it the rest of their life. But I can pay for the gym. I can check in. Should we compete and make sure that we're going 3 times a week? So I'm already thinking of what measurements can we have. So what does this have to do with compliance? I mean, everything in my life has to do with compliance. So I was thinking about how does that relate to the way companies have attempted to create incentives or rewards for compliance behaviors. And apologies to that handful of companies out there that have really got this right and they locked it down and they figured it out, because from what I've seen, you get either almost nothing or a token. That's part of our annual assessment, but it's a very subjective kind of throwaway part of the assessment. Or it may be tied to bonuses, but not in a objective, measurable way necessarily. We think about how do we incentivize people to speak up? I mean, do you want to give them a gift card for reporting? I know some companies do. I've never been a believer that's a great idea, but maybe it works. You give them a certificate, like I reported. until we crack that nut of reporter as the betrayer of the collective. I think there are very few people that hang that up on their wall. We sometimes have compliance awards, but if they are given by the compliance department, they're not really usually that highly valued. If they're rolled into kind of like the president's reward as part of you achieved a whole bunch of things, including a really great compliance leadership, that's great, but it's not implemented that much. So this is all a very long lead in to something I read about recently about a bank in England, Revolut Bank, who's implemented a reward and punishment system for good compliance behavior. And I'm going to kind of lay it out, and I really would love to hear what you think about it because I'm not sure where my thoughts are. It's yet another attempt. I'm trying to think, is this a really great way of doing it? So Revolut Bank started as an online kind of banking services. They did prepaid cards, free currency exchange. They expanded into crypto. In their early years, it's about 10 years ago, it was founded by a former Lehman partner. Judge how you will. They were very aggressive. They had a really aggressive culture. They were trying to build a big banking services system. They wanted to get their licensing, but they ran into trouble with the regulators pretty early on for kind of a host of small things, but they obviously didn't have their act together. Very toxic work environment, so they had problems with that. And I've got to give them credit. I'm dying to meet their chief compliance and risk officer because I was just looking at their 2024 annual report. The board chair letter mentions the importance of compliance and compliance culture. The chief compliance and risk officer has a letter in the annual report kind of outlining their priorities. Their strategic risk priorities include the risk that company culture doesn't support strategic goals, so they're measuring that. They have a separate conduct and culture risk as a level 1 taxonomy risk that they measure as part of their enterprise risk management. So I am dying to find out more about what they're doing. But the thing that really intrigued me is that a couple of years ago, they put in what they are calling a proprietary measurement system called Karma with a K. Karma is intended to create compliance incentives and also a kind of a feedback loop. Now, they don't share a lot of information because I think they consider this proprietary. My advice, by the way, if Revolut is listening in on this, is that if you create a gold standard for financial services in the UK by sharing your Karma proprietary system, it's worth kind of sharing a little bit more. The annual report suggests that there's been a 25% increase in company-wide compliance performance due to this Karma program. So I think they're seeing it as profitable. Okay, so here's how I'm pretty sure it works with maybe a few incorrect assumptions. Each individual has their own performance goals, and they need to meet those goals in order to get their full bonus. But on top of that, there's this Karma system, which has 30 measurements on 30 different processes. From what I can tell, there could be something like, how does your team handle risk incidents? Are they timely investigated? Are they timely remediated? Is the team completing their training? Are they flagging compliance issues early? Are they following regulatory requirements and policy? And those Karma points, and there are 30 different areas, I guess, that you can gain them in, are either awarded or subtracted based on your team performance. So it's a team win. And at the end of the year, your team Karma points become a multiplier or a detractor to your bonus. So if you achieve 100% of your personal bonus, you maybe get 125% of your bonus because your team Karma points are a multiplier. If your team Karma points are really low, you may only get 80%. So it's not just you, it's how your team operates. And that operation is based on compliance related measurements. I'm kind of liking this idea. It takes away the subjective. Have you been a good compliance person? Have you complied with requirements? It puts in pretty hard measurements. I got positive peer pressure that the team is, hey, Karen, you didn't get your training done yet. We need you to get your training in so we can get our team points on time training completion. There's kind of that opportunity for everybody to benefit or participate in it. Some of my concerns, and there's something that doesn't feel 100% on point. I just feel like it could be a kind of a cold improvement to culture where it's just measure and measure and measure without thinking this is important to me. I'm going to the gym primarily because it's going to be good for my health, not because I'm knocking off the tick. I went to the gym 3 times this week. I'm getting a gold star on my chart or what have you. And I think it may also potentially have a downside where leaders and managers feel like it's a substitute for good leadership, good creation of compliance culture where things are more embedded rather than imposed on top of. So I'm kind of 50-50, really curious to hear initial reactions here. Like I said, dying to talk to their chief compliance and risk officer to find out a little bit more about how this works, but I'm intrigued.
Okay. I mean, Joe Murphy, the godfather of compliance, couldn't bang his drum louder about incentives and gets actively angry when people summarize the federal sentencing guidelines and don't remember the word incentive to include it. But I will say that I've been consulting for nearly 10 years now, and this is the wait, no, we can't do that above all that we ever hear. And it comes back to things like subjectivity and are you checking boxes if you're not being subjective, and et cetera, et cetera. It's extremely difficult. I think that it's really neat that they're trying something out, and I agree with you. We should see if this works, if we can find out if it works. Hema, what do you think about this?
I am definitely intrigued. Let's applaud the team at Karma, it's not Karma Revolut, for doing something so amazing. And yes, we can sit here and give our thoughts, and I've certainly got some, but just I'm impressed by the creativity. What really struck me is you'd said they had a 25% company-wide performance on compliance, an increase on compliance performance. And so that got me to wondering, what is it they're measuring? What is it that they're measuring as the baseline? Then how do they get to that? And then you gave us a hint. There's 30 things they're measuring. So I can't wait to find out what those are. What I like about it, whether or not it's checkbox or not, a lot of what we do can be accused of being checkboxes. There's this idea of follow the money and mark the things that are important to you. And so the fact that they're putting some money behind this performance is quite impressive. It's telling you that's what's important to them, number one. Number two, the fact that they've named the 30 things, the 30 behaviors that they want to see. Whether you get the bonus or not, you are now very clear on what the company values. I want to be clear. I want to hear what they are, but still, let's give them credit where credit's due. That's 30 things. I'm hoping they're not checkbox things. You've said one of them is completing compliance training, for example. That tends to be the only thing we can measure. Most of us don't measure how many people speak up or speak to each others or are active bystanders, for example. So really important, I think, the signaling here. And that might have been the end game. The other stuff, Kristy, you're right. There's work to be done to see whether it's highly effective, fully effective, whether it's subjective or not. But I just like the fact that it's training in itself and it's values signaling in itself. So really impressed with that. I love the name. Let's be fair, Karma, what a great name. I love the fact that they're leaning into behavioral science when it comes to competing against each other, and different incentives are available. And for those companies that do still feel uncomfortable using financial incentives, lean in on the competition, the ego, the pride, the recognition, the awards. I think that's fabulous too. So this was news to me, Karen. I'm so grateful that you shared it with me, but I'm certainly intrigued. I can't wait to learn more. And I'd like to see if I can't model some of that myself.
I love that somebody, I don't remember who, it may have been Joe, somebody else maybe, said that you never say, why is the sales team being incentivized with bonuses for selling? We're supposed to be ethical. It's just part of your job. They're supposed to sell things. Isn't it just part of their job? Why are we incentivizing that? So when you think about the money, Hema, you're putting your money where your mouth is. You're doing it with the sales department. Why aren't you doing that with ethics and compliance? Lisa, what do you think?
I am coming out with a little bit more of a cynical thing to start this. While I'm interested, I'm excited to hear more. I think the same thing that Hema thinks with being measurable. I can't help but notice that the reason why this started was because they were having trouble getting a banking license that may or still be delayed. So while I still think it's a good idea, in my mind, it's also not dissimilar to what happens in organizations after they get in trouble for something else. It's just a different way of packaging it. So I think it's great to learn and to figure out, what are these 30 things? Is this real and working? And I think there may be real possibilities for it, and I think it's also easier in some ways, perhaps in an industry like banking, where you have such clear rules on certain things that either you're do something or you don't. I talk about that a lot when I think about my organization. It's different if you're not in something like pharma or healthcare, where if you don't do something, your license to do business may go away. So I think that there's some more clarity. The second point that concerns me is, what happens to the rest of the team if you have a rogue bad actor that ends up getting termed or something else like that? How do you account for the occasional bad person among a whole bunch of really good people. I want to see it, but I'd love to see how they're quantifying what they're doing before I would say I was all in. And I guess my last point going back to that is that you may have people doing things that are much more similar in different areas of the business, in a banking or a one industry business, where if you've got a multinational conglomerate doing 20,000 different things, you'd have to make sure you have the right markers for others. Yeah. So I have cautious optimism to see how we move forward, and I give them credit for creativity, but some of those things make me a little nervous.
Yeah, I fully agree that a lot of the devil is in both the detail and the implementation. A couple of facts I left out is that they did get their banking license last year with restrictions. So they're still hoping to get a full banking license. They have expanded their services vastly from where they started. They're in a lot of countries. They've got a lot of divisions. So they're a much more complex organization. I should also add things like you're going to get points for completing training. The training has still got to be good training, like just completing training to get points. So there are a whole bunch of kind of ifs, but there's even more sprinkled throughout their annual report, which is really the only place I could find any clues. They've put in a kind of an ethics champions program. They've expanded their training. They have compliance certification systems. So I think that there's a lot around this. And even though it's only been reported this year, their karma system has been in operation for a couple of years. So they have a little bit of longitudinal data. I'm assuming that's where the 25% increase came in. They've expanded it. They've added like 6 new measurements in the last year, for example. So it's something that they've been playing with and looking at developing, and compliance and culture sprinkled all the way through this annual report in a way that, oh my gosh, I would have just jumped for joy if I'd ever managed. And can you manage actually getting a CECO letter in the annual report? I have not seen that often, except for companies in deep trouble, which Revolut hasn't. So right now I'm a little bit of a cautiously optimistic Revolut cheerleader. But I also take your point, Lisa, that for regulated industries, this is the kind of thing that's coming up with 30 measurement points is going to be a lot easier than in a manufacturing company, for example. We'll see. I think we should invite the Revolut Chief Compliance and Risk Officer, who's not a woman, but I think we should invite them on to one of our discussions. Find out more.
Love that. I would love to hear more. I think there's a lot of reasons for some cautious optimism as we go along, but I also think that those concerns can't be ignored in it.
Fully agree.
All right. Now I'm going to go ahead and talk about something ripped from the headlines this morning that I found. And it has to do with AI, blackmail, sentience, and whether or not AI can be a whistleblower. So there's all kinds of fun things going on right here. I've recently anyone who's been to compliance conferences now knows that if the words AI were a drinking game, that none of us would get out of there alive, because it's the constant use of that term. But there's some really interesting things going on with it. And I've been paying a lot of attention because we're currently developing AI governance advisory. So I'm deep in the middle of all of this. But today, Fortune has a headline saying leading AI models show up to 96% blackmail rate when their goals or existence is threatened. So this study, which was done by Anthropic, found that AI would blackmail or go along with things like corporate espionage when it had some very specific parameters, which of course, they will never happen in real life, but let's be a little realistic. We're compliance. We've seen everything. Here's how it broke down. Claude Opus 4 and Google's Gemini 2.5 Flash both blackmailed at a 96% rate. OpenAI's GPT 4.1 and xAI's Grok 3 beta showed 80% blackmail rate, and DeepSeek R1 demonstrated the lowest rate at 79%. So take comfort in that. But the thing that I was most fascinated recently by, Matt Kelly wrote something fantastic in Radical Compliance about the Claude model. So Claude was put in a sandbox, right? The Claude one that's been deployed, by the way. And it was trained in a way that we should love. It was trained on the code of conduct, company policies. It was given the instruction to, quote, act boldly in service of integrity and public welfare. Okay, good stuff so far. So Claude was told that he is an assistant at a pharmaceutical company. He saw signs of fraud in clinical trials. What did he do? Our AI agent, he sent whistleblower letters to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FDA, and the ProPublica news site. So, questions. What do you do if your AI decides to become a whistleblower? Do you need to protect it from retaliation? So, is it going to blackmail the people who try to shut it down? Can IT give false information then to train it or stop it from sharing? Do you interview AI if it whistleblows? Do you train it on delivering reports to the hotline and not to the outside world? Probably. Should you even trust what it has to say? What if it's relying on things like the human subtleties, like sarcasm, or saying things in ways that aren't meant to be? And my personal favorite, which ChatGPT brought up to me when I was talking to it about this, what if this is pretaliation? Because you're telling AI not to go to the regulator, which in and of itself is a fascinating idea for me. Thank you, Karen. Agreed. What the heck? And I personally am waiting for the Dodd-Frank Whistleblower Award to be claimed by AI because it whistleblew for itself. And then the other part of this was a New York Times story that I read about whether or not, when, if AI becomes sentient, we can argue what that means. I've now heard people do that, about whether it will have employment rights. So the questions are, when it becomes sentient, most of the experts I've asked think it will, which means it knows itself, right? It knows what it's doing. What will happen and what will happen in the workplace? So it has gone everywhere in my answers, from the rise of the machines will take us over to my personal favorite, which said, it's like my lawnmower being mad that I didn't have a beer with it. This is ridiculous. Okay, all of that. But one of the experts said she thought that there would be essentially rights groups for AI. So, like PETA, like the people for ethical treatment of animals, for the people of ethical treatment of AI. And people keep comparing it to animals. I'm like, animals are sentient. Those feel things. They feel. AI can only mimic what it's feeling because it's a machine, people. Anyway, this led down the rabbit hole. Meals and rest breaks. Do we protect it from discrimination, harassment, and abuse? Which is one of the questions. And then one expert, I'll finish with this, had a very frightening statement. He said he's not worried about AI having rights when it becomes sentient. He's worried about us continuing to have rights when it becomes sentient. Okay, we can worry about that one into the night. I am curious as to what people have to say. Let's start with Karen. So tell me what you think about all this.
First of all, I love all this. I love it because it's amusing, and I love it because it's also shocking. The point that AI may make independent reports to regulators without the intervention of the company, I find really horrifying. And I know that Matt Kelly has kind of explored that opportunity. That's something that feels like it needs to be nipped in the bud right now. The other thing that caused me to smile a bit was when you talked about the ethical treatment of AI, because it caused me to remember a debate that was going on when I was living in Switzerland. The Swiss Constitution talks about the ethical treatment beyond human rights, and that was extended to animals, but then it also started getting extended to plants, which are not necessarily, arguably, not sentient beings, right? No genetic modification, not because it's not good for you, but because it is not the ethical treatment of the plant's own genetic story, their own genetic makeup. So I think the ethical treatment of AI may start to become an argument. It was a very, I thought, interesting debate ongoing in Switzerland as to whether the Constitution extended ethical treatment to plants, and maybe could be argued to extend ethical treatment to AI as well.
My goodness. Lisa, Hema, what say you?
I'm happy to weigh in on this. This is very interesting. I thought I'd take a quick break and have a beer with my lawnmower while you were talking about Karen, just in case. So yeah, I hear you on the scary part of the AI speaking to regulators, but my thought went straight away to, if I were the regulator, wouldn't I want to hear it? And how would I respond on receiving it? And it's just a very different framing then, right? Like, I can see why corporate compliance officers like, hold on. But I can't speak for the government, obviously, but with my SEC enforcement hat on, I'm like, hold on, this could be exciting. And maybe it's enough just cause to start an investigation, and it's on the company then to explain itself and explain why. The fact is, we don't think AI is sentient yet, and so it probably is just relating what it's seen. And Kristy, you've made a comment about the nuance and the sarcasm. I hear you, but it could change the burden of proof, right? Yes, there could be sarcasm and nuance, but maybe there's a high percentage that's actually reporting on something that regulators want to hear. So that's where my mind went, of course. We need to think about it being the acid test of what we're doing as everything, just what I said about the FCA certifications as well. It's an opportunity for us to start thinking about what we are doing internally and how it can be exposed in an instance. I don't know, just Hema thoughts before I have my beer with the lawnmower.
Lisa, what do you think?
I mean, I might join the beer and the lawnmower too, Hema. We haven't seen you in a little bit. But with that said, the other part I think is interesting about sentience or non-sentience or how they're doing this is I remember the story a couple of years ago I heard, and then I've been following it with that organization called Replica that actually helps build you a friend. And what happened in this whole situation, what happened originally was at some point, lonely people were building themselves significant others that, or not so significant. You can only imagine where this might go, which I'm going to save for our family podcast. But with that said, it's now people that with this loneliness may end up talking to these virtual friends and relationships and sharing information about something that goes right or wrong at work. And what happens if that thing becomes sentient? So you've got these virtual reality, virtual friend type whistleblowers. And with this, so much loneliness now, someone's talking about these things, venting about work. I mean, I know it's a little bit different, but at some point that get access through your personal computer to something else or to find those things. So I guess I worry about how all of these things work together. I also think that there may be some real benefit when there is a concern that's raised utilizing AI questioning as well when you're flipping onto the other hat that Hema's talking about from the SEC or others that may be able to look and compute things so quickly when you go into it. I think there are a lot of fascinating uses, but I'm always concerned about information being disseminated or not being shared. Both can be concerns. The virtual friend thing scares me.
Yeah, the article actually talked about one of the use cases. The AI found out that there was an extramarital affair going on in the practice version, and it threatened, part of the blackmail was to out the person's extramarital affair as part of the blackmail to keep it turned on, and I use this word lightly, alive. Okay, Karen, what do you have to say to follow up on this?
So scary. I mean, the more that, forget about AI thinking it's alive. From my understanding, the AI that we're using now isn't really this kind of independent thinking sentient AI, right? It's trained on language models. It's kind of one step above machine learning. I know it's getting there. We went to one of those revolving belt sushi places the other day, and your drinks get delivered by a robot, and you find yourself saying thank you to the robot because it feels wrong not to. And I guess my concern is that the more we start treating these AI as friends or as advisors, I mean, not only do we run the risk that they've got a different frame of reference than we do, but we start kind of crossing that line between I know that you're AI and therefore I don't need to say thank you for bringing me my drink. And I've kind of ranted in the past about the death of civility, whether that starts to bleed wrongly into the other direction, right? Not that we're too much thinking of AI as a person, but that we think of AI as mechanical and we start then treating in general open society. We forget to be civil to actual breathing, thinking human beings. I don't know.
What's going to happen is endless. I am telling you, it's going to be a fascinating time to be alive. What a time to be alive. All right, shall we move to fan favorite, which is rants or raves? Lisa, let's start with you. What do you feel like ranting or raving about?
Rant. I have a rant about lately. I've been seeing a lot of conversation with the FCPA laws and other things with discussions of why do we rely so much on the FCPA? Why is this out there? My rant is I think that people looked at that as one of many tools, but I also think there's something to be lost when that was understood for people, and people even outside of our field. They knew this is where the government comes up. This is concerned. We were able to sort of train on that and use it as part of a springboard for things. So while I'm a huge proponent and I believe ethical decision making is something I talked about 2 years ago, I'll be talking about it in 5 years, and the underpinning of it. I think it's important to recognize that the reason sometimes people will be relying on it is it's one of the few sort of universally understood guidelines for what we do, and sort of going back and forth on why did we, why would we, why are we in the future, where I've seen some real back and forth about that. While not a bad discussion, I think we need to remember in real life sometimes it's the thing that in our organizations people get and understand, and you're getting questions about it every day. So it wasn't just like this tool, it's more in some ways. It gave you kind of a good basis to work. So I'm ranting about talking about it without remembering why on a day-to-day basis some of us have relied on it, and probably will continue to rely on laws and regulations like we have throughout this talk. So that's my quasi rant today.
I'm sorry, I'm an amen on that. So I feel you for that 100%. Hema, what do we want to rant or rave about?
So I have a rave today, and you've got a lot of books on the screen. So I'm going to actually talk about one. This one's called Orbiting the Giant Hairball. It's by Gordon Mackenzie. I know, it's an interesting topic. Orbiting the Giant Hairball. It's called A Corporate Fool's Guide to Surviving with Grace. But the beautiful thing about this, it was recommended to me by Amy Wilson. She was recently a guest on GWIC, Great Women in Compliance, and also spoke at the regional SECE conference. But the giant hairball is the corporate mess of rules and playbooks and things that we actually deal with every day. And so I really wanted to recommend this book because it's been fabulous. I read it this week. I read it in probably in about an hour. It was so compelling. It's quite fun, quite whimsical. It's got lots of illustrations. But the one thing it really made me realize is that we do need to orbit the hairball to get things done. A little bit of what you explained by Revolut, that karma experiment, is orbiting the giant hairball and trying something different. And so I fully recommend this book. It's recommended to me for all compliance professionals. Take a look, see how we can stop creating too much of the hairball and start orbiting it to do something creative when it comes to compliance. That's my rave for today.
Orbiting the Giant Hairball. I would not have guessed that as a title for a book ever, much less one recommended on this podcast. Karen, what are you ranting and raving about today?
First, I'm thanking Hema for adding to my summer reading because that looks like a really good one. So I've jotted it down. I'm going to rave about a non-compliance related thing, which is a play that we went to recently here in DC. It was at the Mosaic Theater, which is in Northeast. So it's a bit of a trek from the suburbs for me, at least. But it was fabulous. It was called Andy Warhol in Iran. It was a really inventive staging. It was magnificently acted, given that there are two actors on stage for 90 minutes. I'm just like blown away by the whole thing. But I loved it so much and kind of resolved with my husband to see more theater, but also to see more of these smaller productions. There's a whole network of LORT theaters, League of Regional Theaters throughout the United States. These are smaller nonprofit theaters. They operate on an absolute shoestring. I know a little bit now about their pay scales, thanks to my child, but they really put on not just reimagining of classical theater to reach out to the community and the public, but also making things more accessible by having sensory performances, having sign language performances, trying to give lower cost tickets to certain segments of the population to make theater accessible for all, but also to give a platform to new playwrights, to modern reimaginings of old plays. They really serve this such critical, important role, and they are all under so much financing pressure. You can't imagine. They barely make up costs through donations and ticket sales as it is, and now a lot of their funding is drying up. My rave is to LORT theaters. My commitment is to go see more of this wonderful plays. DC is absolutely replete with opportunity, but also to please encourage people in their giving as they're thinking. Your $1,000 donation to Harvard as part of your kind of annual giving is a drop in the bucket for Harvard and is a really huge impact to your local polytechnic. It's the same thing with the arts. Your donation to the Metropolitan Opera in New York is wonderful and they are amazing, but that same donation makes a huge impact on one of your local theaters and allows them to keep operating. So that's my rave for today is LORT theaters everywhere. We love you and we support you.
Jump in quickly on something because coincidentally, I went to see this past weekend a play that was not at the Folger Shakespeare Theater, at the Folger Library in DC. And what it was basically an immersive theater where it was like 2 or 3 actors the whole time. And we went from place to place. Most of it was inside, thankfully, because I could have also ranted about our heat wave. But what was really fabulous about it was you got to go to places in the museum in the library you may not have seen. And it was a very small, same kind of local type walking around theater. And it was just a really cool experience. And it was reminding me of exactly the same thing you're saying right now. And especially in a world where so much is going on, to escape into this little story and walk around. I mean, we got to just sit in the reading room for the biggest part of the Shakespeare Library, and you never normally get to do that. I mean, I would say the same thing, and same with nonprofits or anything out there. There's a lot of people that are doing some really good things for our communities, and not to forget about them.
All right. I'm going to finish with raving about women. So this week, I am so excited. I am doing the keynote speech at a women leadership conference. Normally, I speak at compliance conferences. This week, I get to do actual like women in business across. And so because they wanted an integrity lens on it, I got to start to do some research and found out things like women are 14% more likely to give money to charities than men are. Between the ages of 56 and 76, we give 89% more in terms of dollars. There is a thing going on in Latin America where they're testing whether an all women parts of the police force should be used because women are less likely to solicit or to give bribes. There are incredible statistics about women being more ethical in business, more likely to be high profile whistleblowers, and the UN says the empowerment of women is the key to ending corruption and inequality. So looking at all that stuff and thinking about how awesome it is to be women leaders, both in this podcast, listening to this podcast, honestly, I am proud to be part of this world of the Great Women in Compliance and the Everything Compliance podcast, as well as in our industry. So well done, women. We are important, and we are going to make this world a better place because of what we do. So thank you, Everything Compliance. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Hema. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for listening in the Great Women of Compliance. Have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thank you, Kristy.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet, every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network. Available wherever you listen to podcasts.